America's hubris, misjudging the foe, and the fight. The Vietnam War was a tragedy born of miscalculation. It was a conflict that saw the might of the United States military pitted against a determined and resourceful enemy. The roots of this miscalculation lay in a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict and the enemy they were facing. US policymakers, blinded by Cold War ideology, underestimated both their enemy and the battlefield. They viewed the conflict through the prism of global communism, failing to recognize the unique historical and cultural context of Vietnam. This ideological lens distorted their perception, leading to flawed strategies and decisions. They saw the conflict through a simplistic lens of domino theory, believing that the fall of South Vietnam to communism would trigger a regional collapse. This theory, while compelling in its simplicity, ignored the complex realities on the ground. It failed to account for the nationalist fervor that drove the Vietnamese resistance. This simplistic view ignored the deep-seated nationalism of the Vietnamese people, who had fought for centuries against foreign domination. From the Chinese to the French, the Vietnamese had a long history of resisting invaders. This historical context was crucial, yet it was largely overlooked by US strategists. The US leadership, overconfident in its military might, failed to grasp the complexities of fighting a guerrilla war in a hostile and unfamiliar terrain. The dense jungles of Vietnam were unlike any battlefield the US had encountered before. The terrain favored the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, who knew the land intimately. They sent young American soldiers, many of them draftees, into a quagmire, ill-prepared for the brutal realities of jungle warfare. These soldiers, often fresh out of high school, were thrust into a world of ambushes, booby traps, and an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The enemy, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, were masters of this type of conflict, blending seamlessly with the civilian population and employing hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the Americans. Their ability to disappear into the landscape and the local populace made them a formidable foe. The US strategy, focused on attrition and large-scale operations, proved ineffective against an elusive enemy. The American military, designed for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. Large-scale operations often resulted in high casualties with little to show for the effort. The search-and-destroy missions, often resulting in heavy civilian casualties, only alienated the local population and fueled support for the Viet Cong. These missions, intended to root out the enemy, often destroyed villages and displaced civilians, turning the local populace against the Americans. The misjudgment of the enemy's resolve and the misapplication of military power set the stage for a protracted and ultimately unwinnable war. The US entered Vietnam with confidence in its superior firepower and technology, but it was met with an enemy whose determination and tactics rendered those advantages moot. The war dragged on, costing countless lives and leaving deep scars on both nations. The jungle battlefield, guerrilla warfare, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Vietnam War was fought on two fronts: the dense jungles and rice paddies of South Vietnam, where the terrain itself became a formidable adversary. The thick foliage and swampy conditions created a challenging environment for the American forces, who were more accustomed to conventional warfare. And the intricate network of supply lines known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail was not just a single path, but a complex web of routes that allowed the North Vietnamese to move men and material with remarkable efficiency. The Viet Cong, masters of guerrilla warfare, utilized the terrain to their advantage, disappearing into the jungle after swift attacks and blending seamlessly with the local population. Their intimate knowledge of the landscape allowed them to set up ambushes and traps that were nearly impossible for the American forces to predict or counter. They turned the Americans' superior firepower against them, using booby traps and ambushes to inflict heavy casualties. These traps ranged from simple punji sticks to more sophisticated explosive devices, all designed to create maximum disruption and fear among the American troops. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a logistical marvel, snaked through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, supplying the Viet Cong with weapons, ammunition, and reinforcements. This trail was the lifeline of the North Vietnamese war effort, enabling them to sustain prolonged engagements despite heavy losses. This intricate network of roads, trails, and waterways, constantly bombed by the US, proved remarkably resilient. Despite relentless aerial bombardment, the North Vietnamese managed to keep the trail operational, showcasing their ingenuity and determination. The North Vietnamese, with unwavering determination, repaired the damaged sections with astonishing speed, ensuring a steady flow of supplies to their comrades in the south. Their ability to quickly rebuild and adapt was a testament to their resourcefulness and commitment to their cause. The US efforts to cut off this supply line, including the controversial bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, proved largely ineffective. These bombings often caused significant collateral damage, further alienating the local populations and complicating the American mission. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained a potent symbol of North Vietnamese resilience and a constant thorn in the side of the American war effort. It represented the unyielding spirit of the North Vietnamese, who were willing to endure immense hardships to achieve their goals. The combination of guerrilla tactics and the unwavering logistical support of the North made it increasingly difficult for the US to achieve a decisive victory. The American forces, despite their technological and numerical superiority, found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition, unable to break the will of the North Vietnamese. A nation divided, media, protests, and the erosion of morale. As the war dragged on, the conflict in Vietnam increasingly divided the American public. The initial support for the war effort began to wane as more and more Americans questioned the purpose and the cost of the conflict. Families, friends, and communities found themselves at odds, with heated debates becoming a common occurrence in households and public spaces alike. The uncensored images of the war, beamed directly into living rooms across the nation by television, brought the brutality of the conflict home. For the first time, the American public could see the horrors of war in real time, with graphic footage of battles, wounded soldiers, and devastated villages. This unprecedented media coverage played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. The images of body bags draped in American flags, the carnage of battle, and the suffering of Vietnamese civilians fueled growing anti-war sentiment. These powerful visuals stirred emotions and led many to question the morality and justification of the war. The stark contrast between the government's optimistic reports and the grim reality on the ground became increasingly apparent. The media, initially supportive of the war effort, began to question the Johnson and Nixon administration's handling of the conflict. Journalists and news anchors started to investigate and report on the discrepancies between official statements and the actual situation in Vietnam. This shift in media coverage marked a turning point in public perception. Investigative journalism exposed the credibility gap between the optimistic pronouncements of government officials and the grim reality on the ground. Reports of inflated body counts, misleading information, and strategic blunders eroded trust in the government. The term credibility gap became synonymous with the growing disconnect between the administration's narrative and the truth. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the Viet Cong, shattered the illusion of American progress and further eroded public support for the war. The widespread and coordinated attacks during the Tet holiday caught American forces off guard and demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Viet Cong. This event was a psychological blow to the American public, who had been led to believe that victory was near. College campuses became hotbeds of protest, with students organizing marches, sit-ins, and teach-ins to voice their opposition to the war. These young activists were driven by a sense of moral duty and a desire for social justice. They challenged the status quo and demanded an end to the conflict, often facing backlash from authorities and conservative segments of society. The anti-war movement, fueled by a potent mix of moral outrage, fear of the draft, and a growing distrust of the government, became a powerful force in American society. Demonstrations, rallies, and acts of civil disobedience were common as people from all walks of life joined the cause. The movement's influence extended beyond the streets, impacting political discourse and policy decisions. The division on the home front, reflected in the growing anti-war sentiment, made it increasingly difficult for the US to sustain the war effort, both politically and morally. The erosion of public support undermined the government's ability to continue the conflict, leading to a re-evaluation of military strategies and ultimately contributing to the decision to withdraw from Vietnam. The legacy of this era remains a poignant reminder of the power of media, protest, and public opinion in shaping the course of history. The global chessboard Cold War constraints and economic strain. The Vietnam War cannot be understood in isolation from the broader context of the Cold War. The conflict became entangled in the global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, each vying for influence in the developing world. The Soviet Union and its allies provided substantial military and economic aid to North Vietnam, viewing it as a proxy war against American imperialism. The US, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, poured billions of dollars into the war effort, straining its economy and diverting resources from domestic programs. The Johnson administration's decision to fund both the war and the Great Society social programs fueled inflation and led to economic instability. Moreover, the US was constrained in its conduct of the war by the fear of provoking a wider conflict with the Soviet Union or China. The specter of nuclear war loomed large, limiting the U.S. options and forcing it to fight a limited war against a determined enemy. The global ramifications of the Cold War, with its complex web of alliances and ideological struggles, had a profound impact on the course and outcome of the Vietnam War. Gap 3S. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, both on the battlefield and in the minds of the American public. Launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the offensive caught the US and South Vietnamese troops off guard, leading to fierce battles in cities and towns across South Vietnam. Images of the intense fighting, including the iconic scenes from the Battle of Hue and the attack on the US Embassy in Saigon, were broadcast into American living rooms, shattering the illusion of imminent victory that had been propagated by US officials. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong demonstrated their ability to strike at the heart of South Vietnam, undermining the credibility of the US military and political leadership. The psychological impact of the Tet Offensive was profound. It eroded public support for the war, fueled anti-war sentiment, and deepened the divide within American society. President Lyndon B. Johnson, recognizing the shifting tides, announced that he would not seek re-election, signaling a shift in US policy towards de-escalation and negotiation. The Tet Offensive exposed the harsh realities and complexities of the Vietnam War, highlighting the resilience and determination of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. It underscored the futility of a war fought without a clear path to victory and amplified the calls for peace and withdrawal. The offensive marked a pivotal moment in the conflict, reshaping US strategy and hastening the eventual end of American involvement in Vietnam. Gap 3S. The Tet Offensive stands as a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of war and the profound impact of public perception on the course of history. The Vietnam War was not just a conflict confined to Southeast Asia. It was a theater in the larger geopolitical struggle of the Cold War. The involvement of major powers like the United States, the Soviet Union, and China turned Vietnam into a battleground for competing ideologies of communism and capitalism. The United States viewed its engagement in Vietnam as a crucial front in the fight against the spread of communism. This perspective was shaped by the domino theory, which posited that the fall of one Southeast Asian nation to communism would lead to the subsequent collapse of neighboring countries. Consequently, US policymakers felt compelled to support South Vietnam to prevent a communist takeover. On the other side, the Soviet Union and China provided substantial support to North Vietnam, supplying weapons, training, and financial aid. This support was part of their broader strategy to counter US influence and spread communist ideology. The rivalry between the Soviet Union and China also influenced their involvement, as both sought to assert their dominance within the communist bloc. International politics played a crucial role in shaping the strategies and outcomes of the Vietnam War. Diplomatic efforts such as the Paris Peace Accords were influenced by the broader Cold War context. The superpowers' desire to avoid direct confrontation led to a proxy war, where Vietnam became a testing ground for military tactics and political will. The Vietnam War also had significant implications for international relations. It strained US alliances, particularly with countries that questioned the legitimacy and morality of the war. The conflict highlighted the limitations of military power in achieving political objectives and underscored the importance of diplomacy and international cooperation. In the end, the Vietnam War serves as a poignant reminder of how global politics can shape the course of regional conflicts. It illustrates the complexities and unintended consequences of international involvement in local disputes, and the profound impact such involvement can have on the lives of millions. Gap 3S. The interplay of international politics in the Vietnam War underscores the interconnectedness of global events and the far-reaching consequences of geopolitical decisions. It stands as a testament to the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define our world, reminding us of the enduring need for thoughtful and measured diplomacy in the pursuit of peace. The final years of the Vietnam War were marked by a series of dramatic events that culminated in the fall of Saigon. By the early 1970s, the conflict had taken a heavy toll on both sides. The United States, grappling with increasing anti-war sentiment at home and the mounting costs of the war, began to seek a way out. The policy of Vietnamization, initiated by President Richard Nixon, aimed to transfer the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces, while gradually withdrawing American troops. Despite the efforts to bolster South Vietnam's military capabilities, the situation on the ground remained dire. The North Vietnamese army, bolstered by continuous support from the Soviet Union and China, launched a series of offensives that tested the resilience of South Vietnamese forces. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 brought a temporary halt to the fighting, but peace proved elusive. The ceasefire was tenuous, and both sides accused each other of violations. As American troops continued to withdraw, the South Vietnamese government faced increasing pressure from the north. The economic aid promised by the United States dwindled, further weakening South Vietnam's ability to sustain its defense. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched the Spring Offensive, a decisive and coordinated campaign that overwhelmed South Vietnamese defenses. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. Images of helicopters evacuating American personnel from the U.S. Embassy rooftop became iconic symbols of the chaotic and desperate final days. The capture of Saigon by North Vietnamese forces led to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, closing a tragic chapter in the nation's history. The aftermath of the war left deep scars on the Vietnamese people. The country faced immense challenges in rebuilding and healing from the devastation. For the United States, the Vietnam War left a legacy of profound reflection and a re-evaluation of its foreign policy. The war underscored the limitations of military intervention in achieving political goals and highlighted the importance of understanding local contexts in international conflicts. The fall of Saigon stands as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war and the complexities of global politics. It serves as a testament to the resilience of the Vietnamese people and the enduring impact of the Vietnam War on the collective memory of nations. As we reflect on the final years of the Vietnam War, we are reminded of the importance of pursuing peace through diplomacy and understanding rather than conflict and division. The lessons learned from this tumultuous period continue to resonate, shaping our approach to international relations and our quest for a more peaceful world.